Today on Crazed Performance Repair, we're continuing our series of the full AFM delete on the newer GM engines, the 2014 plus direct injected models. Now, this video is a video from quite a while back. I'm just finally getting around to editing. You can see I'm in a different shop. That is because I have moved since this video was originally made, but not edited. Now you guys are seeing it today, and this is what you'll see in any of my future videos after this video if you happen to subscribe. So let's go ahead and get started with the video, and hopefully you enjoy it. Thanks for watching. First things first, we are going to prep all the gasket surfaces, make sure they're nice and clean and dry. When the time comes to put a little RTV on, I will have to spray it one more time with a little brake clean and a rag to get them properly cleaned to make sure that I can put it on for the front timing cover there. Now, this is doing everything with the oil pan on. Because of that, I have to wiggle the pump around when I do get to the timing chain. But first, we have to put the camshaft in. Putting the camshaft in, you can see I'm going to clearly lube up any surface that touches the cam bearings, and then along with the rollers for the lifters themselves, slide that guy in there. And then of course we are going to get to the lifters. When we put the lifters in, we're going to put them in with the flat section being parallel with the length of the cylinder head or surface or the block itself. And then we're going to go ahead and get to the timing cam plate or the camshaft oil plate. When we put this camshaft plate on there, we want to be sure to check the seal, make sure that it's a little bit raised. If it's completely flat, it may be a good time to replace it. It will not drop oil pressure a whole lot, but it can lose a little bit of pressure out the sides of it if it's bad enough and if it's warped a little bit. That does not happen very often. It's very rare. But it does flatten out quite often and just not seal as good as it should, I suppose. Be sure to torque them down according to spec. Now, this engine, being the newer one, it's going to have the tapered screw. I believe, but I am not positive. Double check yourself or ask me on my webpage. I can give you the details with torque specs. I believe, if I recall correctly, it's only like 12 foot-pounds for those little screws. They don't require a whole lot at all. They're very, very low torque. It's 11 or 12. And because of that, you got to be cautious. You do not want to over torque these things whatsoever. If you do, you will crack or break that little plastic or that little metal plate that's on there. As I install the actual cam sprocket itself, being I'm doing this job without removing the oil pan, that sprocket is going to be really big challenge to get in and to make sure it's lined up properly. You got to make sure it's lined up properly, and it's very difficult trying to see the mark on the crank sprocket, which is why I actually put notches or lines on the chain and the sprocket when I do these jobs, just to make sure that I can get it to line up properly. I try and mark everything to the best of my ability, and I do it with the cylinder one on top dead center, of course. That way I can always come back and find top dead center with a cam degree wheel if I really have to, though I never seem to need to. I just try and make sure I cover my butt, more or less. So getting this guy in, obviously quite a challenge there, but once you do get it in there, torquing it down is a whole nother story. The following audio was recorded during the video, and I kept bumping the microphone, so it gets a little hard to hear at times, but bear with me. Alright, so I have not torqued this down yet. I will in a moment, but I got these little guys in the mail. These are for setting this oil pump. I can't use them, unfortunately. They sit up here like this, and you can see that they are slotted. So when you put the bolts in there, they can go like this, right? I was supposed to, originally, bolt these on with the pump installed, put them against the pump, tighten the bolts down. That way, the pump would be in its set position, so that when I pulled it off, I can go to put it back on and it'll land right where it was in the first place. Because I didn't have these before I pulled the pump off, I screwed myself. So now, I get to play around with feeler gauges to center the pump on the sprocket for the timing chain here, and once I get that set, I might have to take this pump, rotate it against the seal that's down at the bottom, and when it's against the seal tight enough, I can finally tighten these bolts down. So I'm going to play around with that. I won't make you guys watch that, because you should use one of these guys here, or two of these guys here. That way you don't have to worry about that. But I screwed up. So I'm going to do that, and then I'll bring you back so I can torque this guy down and continue the rest of the project. Oh, that was my bad. I just torqued this thing down. I went to turn the camera off, and I turned the camera on instead. Oops. So, all you gotta do to torque this thing, I tighten the crap out of this nut, and I have a wrench here holding it. I set it to the, 48? Yeah, 48 foot-pounds, and torqued it to the 48 foot-pounds. Then I went to the 90 degrees, and did the 90-degree pass, and of course this thing tells me where it's at. If you don't have one of these fancy torque wrenches, either get one of the dial gauges, or actually mark 90 degrees versus the bolt that you're torquing. So, this is torqued down. Now I have to move on to cylinder heads, timing cover, all that crap. Probably going to do the timing cover first, just to get it out of the way, get everything, so that nothing can fall in here, because this is risky right now, of something falling in the pan. And it's kind of dumb of me to be putting these things up here, but is what it is, so be it. I'm going to go ahead and get a timing cover installed. Now you notice right before I put the timing cover on there, I put a little bit of extra thick Lucas oil, the stabilizer stuff, right on top of that timing chain to add a little lube to the chain. That is basically just a way to make sure the chain's not dry at first startup. It probably wouldn't hurt anything, but I like to do it anyway just for extra security measure basically. Now this red stuff that I just put on that sealing surface there, that is an anaerobic sealer. I'll go ahead and throw a link down in the description if I can remember. But that stuff is great for putting seals on if the seal fits tightly. If the seal does not fit tightly, you don't want to use that. The older LS-based engines did not fit very tightly on a lot of them, so it's not good for those. But this one seemed to work pretty good. It was a pretty tight fit, so I was able to use that stuff. On the older ones, I like to use a very thin film of RTV. And the only reason I do that is just in case the timing cover is scratched and I did not see the small scratch in there. Now you're going to hear the torch that's in the background. What I'm currently doing is heating up that balancer. I'm going to heat up the center of the balancer, and I'm going to use an infrared gun to measure the thing. I'm going to try and get it between 2 and 300 degrees Fahrenheit. You do not want it over 300 degrees Fahrenheit because then you risk burning the seal that is in there. But at about 250 degrees Fahrenheit is the perfect temperature, and you can easily install that thing on, at least enough so that you can get the bolt in there to walk it on the rest of the way without risking anything if you move very, very quickly. If you move slowly or stop for any reason, you're probably going to want to get a proper balancer installer. It's a special thread thing with two different threads. One thread fits the threads inside the crankshaft, and the other thread is a fine thread so that it's got more power to pull in that balancer that's a press fit onto the crankshaft. Now that brake clean that I just sprayed on the rag there, that was to help cool it off and get rid of some of that Lucas that I had used as a lube for the sake of the seal, and I used that lube as a way to cool down that balancer. The thing that I had mentioned earlier about holding the crank is a better option than what I did here. I used a very large plate and the head bolts in order to hold the piston into place. Of course, I used a socket. I got the most leverage, so the piston halfway down the cylinder, and then locked up the engine by holding on to that cylinder. Now, when I was trying the first attempt, I tried it with just top dead center or close to top dead center, but I did not have enough leverage, and it felt like it was going to break something. So I just stopped, I dropped the cylinder back down, and then I used a socket, and I had much better results. So torquing this thing down is 89 foot-pounds. Loosen the bolt. It says 360 degrees. They just mean loosen the bolt. Then you got to do 59, I believe. I'll double check that. 59 foot-pounds, and then 200 degrees of rotation. Now, 59 plus 200 degrees of rotation will exceed this torque wrench's capability. So I'm going to torque it down minus the green, and then I have to go in here and mark the bolt. I won't be able to show you guys because you won't be able to see it really, but I'm going to mark the bolt, mark where I need to be, and then turn the bolt until I reach that mark. So I'm going to get started and torque this thing down. You can see my version of holding the thing is by stopping a piston. Now there is a tool. Oh, great. I got to go all the way around until the piston comes. There is a tool that holds the flywheel from the starter hole. But being I have the cylinder heads off, I can just go to the piston and use that. You might think, well, that's a lot of stress on that piston. Well, not really, because when you think about it, you have an explosion going on in there with hundreds of PSI at some points. And that is going to be a lot of stress on those pistons compared to what I'm doing here. I will throw a link in the description for the tool that holds the flywheel if you prefer that option. 59 foot-pounds is confirmed. So 59 is the pre-torque. There it is. Now I got to go and mark things. So I have me here a freshly machined, cleaned up cylinder head. It had a valve job. It had the surface milled, and I highly, highly recommend that you do that to your engine too if you're in this kind of a project. Because this surface, contrary to what people believe, is always warped. Unless it was a head that was put on, maybe ran just a little bit like in a race engine application, and then taken off right away because they realized they needed to do something or they wanted to change something or whatever. But if it's been running like this one for 90-some thousand plus miles, it is going to be warped. You could put a straight edge on here all day and night, and you might think it's straight. The moment you put it on a milling machine and start cutting the surface, you're going to see it cuts really aggressive in one area, really light in another area, and aggressive in another. It's going to be all kinds of kittywampus. And they always have more cutting going on around the bolt holes because the metal warps towards where the bolt tension is. Now this one here, I can see a spot right here that cut a little bit lighter. That must have been a low spot on the cylinder head, and as soon as he got it to cut that area, that's when he quit his cut. So I will be bringing a video forth for that someday here, and if I do, I'll bring it up in the corner. But for now, I have not made a video of a cylinder head being cut to show how bad they get. You also want to make sure you do a proper valve job. Not a valve lap, that won't work long term. Do a proper valve job where you cut the valves. So I'm going to go ahead and put this on and continue assembling this vehicle here.
As we put the cylinder heads on here, you are going to see me put the bolts in, and I'm going to use an impact just to bring them down to contact point. That's all I'm using the impact for. And then as soon as I get that done, I will be putting the bolts on their first torque with the proper torque sequence. I'm also moving the manifolds back and forth as I'm putting the bolts in because the manifolds are in the way for the bolts, and you'll see me pry at the manifolds here to do so. You can see I am doing the complete and final torque, one cylinder head at a time. Once the heads are on, I will be moving to the fuel pump roller unit that is sitting against the cam and putting the valley cover on.
Well, we need to do these injector seals here. So I have a couple things that make it so that you can do this at home and be able to make your own tool, per se, to install these injector seals. Now, what you're going to need is a small rod. I believe this was an old 5/16 drill bit. I've had this laying around because I made this quite a while ago. But basically, I just took it to the grinder holding it with a drill and ground a taper in the thing, right? And then I have a little bit of a cup shape here. When I originally built this, I built it for something else, I believe. I don't remember what, but it works perfectly for this. And all you do is you take these guys here and you put them on here, and it stretches out the seal. So you need to stretch out the seal to put it on because it's far too small. Before I do all that, though, we need to know how to remove these seals, and we're going to need to clean this up. So, grab a rag here, and the first thing I'm going to do is just go ahead and wipe these down really quick. Now this, of course, only gets rid of the main grime, doesn't really clean it up that great. So I'm going to take a wire brush here and wire brush these guys off a little bit. And I'm going to hit the tips of them real lightly. I'm not brushing hard in any sense of the matter. This is actually a soft stainless steel wire brush. It does not have hard or stiff bristles. They're rather soft, rather gentle. Now if you like and you don't feel comfortable using the stainless steel, you could use a brass brush. It'll work just as well, and it'll be gentler on the tips here. Not that that's really necessary. A little bit of a piece of seal stuck here, it looks like. There we go. I'm going to wipe them off one more time. And you notice I did not pull the injectors out of the holes there. I decided I'm not going to replace those seals. They didn't leak. I never took them out. I never took it apart. And I guess these injectors are pretty common to fail in the first place. So I prefer tampering with them less if possible in hopes that I don't end up with a problem when I go to put it back together. So now we need to remove the seals. We need a small razor blade. And we're very carefully going to put a little bit of a slot in there. Just real light. If you feel you're pushing on the metal, don't push any harder. You can kind of feel where the metal is. And then just pop the seal off of there like that, right? Now, with this guy here, all I have to do is push it down a little bit to get the pre-stretch going. I have one socket size here that fits that to push it down a little bit more. Then I have another socket. This is a 12 point. And this will, if I'm careful enough, I push it on the rest of the way. Now it is stretched out, so I'm going to bring it all the way to the back like that. And then put it over top of this guy here and give it a push. And then once I have it on here, I can just go to the further back one first. And then I do the next one, and I'm going to put that on the front. And that is basically the simple install without a fancy install tool of any sort to put this set of seals on here. You see, once you get rolling here, it goes fairly quick and smooth, and it's pretty easy to do. So now these two are loose on here. What do you do after this point? So I created a little tool here. It's just a chunk of aluminum. I had some scrap round aluminum laying around from the lathe, and I drilled some holes in it, stepped it up, and then took and contoured it gradually to get it to fit. Now what it does is the size that this thing is, even the ones that are squished down, it has a little bit of a tight fit to it. Not horribly tight, but a little bit of a tight fit. So I polished the inside of it really good. And what I'm doing is I'm just taking a little bit of this Sil Glide stuff. If you've never used this stuff, it's amazing. I'll go ahead and throw a link in the description. But this stuff is really good for seals, specifically O-rings, to get them to go into place. Now you can see how sloppy loose this spot is. These are the ones that I need to squish down yet. So I'm going to put a little Sil Glide on them. And then I'm going to grab my new little tool here. Actually, I'm going to do it to these two so that when these go in, they install a little bit easier. But all I do is I take this guy here, and now I'm able to push this on. It goes on about yay far. Pull it off of there, and now the seals are squished down the way they're supposed to be. They're nice and tight. They don't wiggle around at all. And it's that simple. So now I have a nice, neat little tool. I don't know if one of these is available on the market. Perhaps I'll look. I wasn't going to sit and wait for one to come in because I want to get this vehicle done, so I just made one. But if one is available, I will try and link it. So I'm going to go ahead and finish the rest of these seals. I already did that one. And then I will go back to the vehicle, and we're going to work on getting the grounds and stuff like that attached while these things are sitting and shrinking. And once they've sat for about an hour worth of time, then I will go ahead and put the rails in and get everything else installed.
So as I install these exhaust manifold gaskets here, we're going to talk about a couple of things that I'm about to check. I'm going to go ahead and throw the valve cover on there, of course, but I'm going to be putting the injectors in here soon. When I drop those fuel rails in place, I'm going to tap them down into place, and you'll notice me spray a little bit of schmutz at each injector. What I'm doing is I'm spraying a soap over the injector area where the hole is, where I just inserted the injector, and then I'm pouring water in there. That water is to dilute the soap, of course, so I can create bubbles. And then you'll notice me turning over the engine once I do this. The turning of the engine is so that I get compression in each cylinder, and if there is a gasket leak for one of those injectors, I will see it simply because it will bubble out of the soapy water. So that soapy water is a very good way to test these things, but if you happen to not clean out the holes of those injectors properly when you do this, when you do the install, you could tear a seal, but the other seal will seal it, so it's not necessarily good enough. In fact, this one I found out later had a seal that blew out after my test drive. In fact, it was after the customer even got it. So make sure that you clean out those holes really well before you dare install the injectors. Up next is the water pump. We're going to go ahead and throw the bolts in the water pump and torque them to the 18 to 20 foot-pounds that I typically torque them to. Got to, of course, throw the alternator and accessory belt brackets on there. There's a couple of hidden bolts on this thing. Just try and remember where everything went. It's pretty self-explanatory there. And of course, now we have to move the AC and radiator situation around to get all that installed. You can see that disconnected line there. That is actually a cooler line for the transmission, I believe, if I remember correctly. If you need to slow this video down, feel free to slow it down so that you can try and isolate parts that you may have forgotten where they go as you see me assemble it.
So I am to the point now on this thing where I have the fittings in place, I have the injectors down, I have the bolts snugged. I need to tighten these fittings. They do actually have a torque spec. Now, the torque spec on these fittings is 21 foot-pounds. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a torque wrench, and you might think, how the hell are you going to use a torque wrench? Well, on a crow's foot wrench. So when it comes to a torque wrench, using a crow's foot, you have to be aware of how you're operating that thing in order to get a reasonably accurate torque. So let's go ahead and go over that real quick. So my torque wrench is set at, well, not yet. There we go. It's set at 21 foot-pounds. And we need to torque those down. Now, you would think you would need to do a calculator to figure out the extra leverage you're getting from this fitting, but that's actually not true. You're going to be able to be accurate with this thing so long as you keep your torque wrench in the correct angle. What do I mean by that? Now, when you're on your torque wrench here, if you are at this position when you're torquing it down, you are going to increase your leverage slightly because your pivot point goes from here to here and it's being extended this direction. However, if you torque it when you're at 90 off from it, you're not going to change your torque amount, believe it or not. So either this way or this way and you're fine. If you go this way, you're going to under torque it. So I think I have that right. Well, you couldn't go that way anyway. It doesn't really matter because the line won't fit there. But what you need to be is at a 90 from this thing. So we're going to go ahead, put this on there. And without doing the ratchet factor, we're going to treat it like a regular wrench and go ahead and get this thing torqued down. So you can see I'm having to pull it off every time. And if it ever does get to the point where it clicks, we will have it torqued. There it is. We're going to push slow because when you're going quickly, it will click early. There it is. We got to do it a few times because you're actually seating that line's position. Okay, there we have it. We have it torqued down, and we should be good to go now. So I'm going to go ahead and continue on with the assembly. Get the intake back on, and we should be good to go after I do that. Now, before we put this guy on, we also have to put this thing on. I don't know why it has a star on it. Made in Texas? That'd be weird. Anyway, this guy, normally I take the foams that are under intakes and I throw them out. If you've been paying attention to my channel, usually I throw these things out because they are normally a disaster for mice. They will create mouse nests. However, this one is a little bit different. You can see it's got the fuel line passages. It's got the cavity for the fuel pump. It's got the cavity for the fuel rail, fuel injectors. It fits very, very tightly. Because it fits so tightly on that side, and because this side matches the intake. Oh, there goes all my bolts. The intake so nicely. You can see it has this little divot here that matches that. And then, of course, this all matches the back. You can actually see it's even got little notches here. I believe that matches the intake somehow, some way, maybe. Let's see here. God, it fits so nice. It fits so perfectly that a mouse could not build a nest inside of this thing. The mouse could, however, chew up one area and create a hole in it and create a nest. But the chances of that are not very likely. And it's more likely they're going to create a nest if you leave this out on this particular vehicle. So I recommend putting this back in on this one. Now, most of the vehicles, I do not recommend putting them on, because most vehicles, what they do is they have a little, like most GMs, for instance, they have just a foam piece and a foam piece. And it's just this really easy to rip apart foam. And mice love that stuff. They'll just chew a hole right through it. They'll rip it apart, go in there underneath the intake, build their nest, and it'd be good to go. Now, this particular vehicle did have a attempted mouse nest. It was sitting back in this corner here. I just pushed it back and let it fall down to the floor. The mouse tried to get up here to make a nest, and he couldn't. So I just stuffed something between the wiring harness there and here, which also could be a problem, of course, because mice chew wires, and chewing wires, bad, very bad. So, there's nothing I could do back there, though, because there's nothing I could block it off with. It doesn't work. You're screwed. Just try and keep mice out of your garage, set up mouse traps, whatever. All right. There we have it. Nice and snug, tight fit. You can see it contours to just about everything under here. It's so perfect. I mean, it doesn't even leave much of a gap right here. So there's no way a mouse is going to build a nest in there unless he actually chews the foam to pieces. By then, he's probably dead, and his relatives are moving in, basically. So let's get the intake on there. And I'm actually going to pull all the bolts off the intake, leave them in a pile. That way I don't risk dropping any of them in the hole, which is also the reason I wanted to pull that cover off as well. So just moments earlier, I was going to try something. So this is my first one of these that I am doing in the LT base, per se. I finally got one in. It's taken way longer than I ever expected. But I'm, of course, trying to look for all the little shortcuts and avenues on the first one. So whenever I do the next one, I can figure out what I need to do to make things quicker and smoother for me. So one of the things I did, I like to clean things up for people before I put them back together, as much as I can realistically without wasting too much time. And I wanted to clean underneath this thing, but I also wanted to remove it because this is kind of in the way for the bolts that are way down here. You can see they kind of sit way down here. And when you have this intake in place, all those coils and stuff are in the way. So the coils are sitting, like this, the coils and valve cover, and it's kind of in the way. So you have to put these in here ahead of time. Now, I was hoping I could leave this off and then go ahead and put the bolts in after the tighten it down and then put this thing on after the fact. But GM decided not to let that happen because they have it as a back cover here. You can see this big flap here. So you can't really do it that way. And so there's not much advantage to having this off. In fact, it's a disadvantage because then you can't put it on. Unless, of course, you planned on leaving it off. But this intake, admittedly, is kind of ugly underneath. So I don't plan on leaving it off. So now I got to go ahead and throw these bolts back in here and then get it torqued all down, and I will go ahead and throw a torque spec up on the screen there for this thing. It might not be for your particular vehicle. Be sure to double check for your vehicle. I am not going to be responsible for missed torque numbers, but this should be a basis for the majority of them, if not all of them. Well, the rest of this is pretty self-explanatory. It's basically just getting the system all hooked back up as far as the intake side of things go. A couple small things, I gotta put this guy back on because I didn't disconnect the connector. It was being difficult. It was easier just to zip out a bolt. But let me know down in the comments below how you like the narration version of this video, where I narrate over top versus talking in the video a lot. Normally I talk while doing the video, but this one I decided to narrate it and see how well it went. So let me know what your thoughts are. With that, like, share, subscribe, and as always, hope to see you in the next video. Thanks for watching. Well, it's been running for a little bit now. I totally missed the startup. I thought I hit record. I only turned the camera on. So, how did startup go? It was loud. It made some clattering. It wasn't like solid, nasty loud, but it did have a lot of light lifter ticking going on. Not huge, but that's given with brand new lifters. I revved it up for a little while. I left it around 2 grand, 2100, something like that, just to make sure that I kept everything moving, kept the oil moving, kept things going. And after, I don't know, a minute and a half, 2, it started to quiet down considerably. We're about 3 minutes in now, and you can hear that it sounds absolutely great. So oil pressure is good. We can see that right in here. I wish I would have recorded it for you guys. You would have saw how much it was smoking. It was definitely smoking a bit at first. Had a lot of the oil smoke, but not as horrible as you might think. Of course, I keep the cylinders dry. I try not to get a bunch of oil in them, so that also helps with that. I'm going to have to top off my antifreeze a little bit. It's a little low, but that's probably an air pocket. I did do a vacuum fill on this cooling system, so I don't expect it to go much lower than what it is. But aside from that, this job is completed.